Hello everyone. Welcome to AZAYA Sutra, a podcast series by Samavesh-Mcc, an initiative by the students of Mount Carmel College, Department of Public Policy, Bangalore, where we have meaningful discussion, constructive criticism, and suggestions on any issue that needs to be addressed for change making. I am Anshika Mathews, your host for today. To start our series, we have Mr. Alrex Romer, who runs an NGO called ARAD that works towards advocacy and research of prisoner-related data in India and works in academia, designing programs and tools such as toolkits, games, and resource platforms to analyze policy from different lenses. Welcome, sir. We are honored to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anshika.
Today we will be discussing on your thesis topic, which is Marginalization by Incarceration, the rise of majority nationalism and its effect on imprisonment of religious minorities in Indian populist states from 1998 to 2019. So sir, before we go ahead, would you like to just give a brief on your abstract and why did you choose this topic?
Yeah, sure, Anshika. I think to explain why I chose this topic, it's important to have a quick brief as to how I got into prisons and prison research in the first place. When I was still a student and studying public policy, I was very intrigued about the concept of the public part of public policy, right? So public is the area where we feel that we need the intervention of the government or the ruling party or whoever's in power to intervene so that we can have uniform policy that makes all of our lives better. One of these areas is prisons, right, and law and order and punishment. I became particularly intrigued as to how is that such an important part of public policy and yet so little is known about it. Upon researching further and finding out what further data I can uncover as to how our legal system functions post-trial, so a lot of documentation on court and trial, not so much documentation on what happens after the trial. There were certain trends that emerged, certain patterns that emerged that fascinated me. One such trend, for example, was just the sheer number of people in prison who haven't been convicted yet. Another such pattern was the sheer diversity of backgrounds of prisoners. One that particularly stood out to me was the religious and ethnic backgrounds of prisoners, and how there was an over-representation of minority populations in prisons. And that's what formed the basis of this thesis. Yeah.
So my second question to you would be, there are a lot of people who disagree with prison reforms. Any prisoner should be punished according to their crime, is what people say. For example, rapists, murderers. So do you agree to this statement? And if no, what do you think can be done to turn the behavior of the society?
You know, when we do our surveys and we tend to survey general public opinions across various age groups and various demographics. And we've always noticed for these two particular crimes, in fact, you just mentioned them, for these two particular crimes, murder and rape, there seems to be a very big distinction between opinion on what to do with perpetrators of those crimes versus other crimes. So generally, we find that when it comes to prison reform, we find people being on board with it for things like, let's say, property crime, petty crime, theft, kidnapping, all of that, but definitely not on board with it for murder and for rape. And we try to explore why that is. You know, what is so different about these particular crimes? Of course, the heinous nature is apparent, but why is it so importantly treated? I think where we have to wonder about change is, why is there not a bigger focus on trial rather than on punishment? You know, even when something is reported in the news, the first place that everyone's mind goes is, how should we punish these people? But for punishment, we first have to have a judicial system that allows people to go through a trial process that is fair and actually make it to the prison system. right? So I think one of the reasons why people are not on board with prison reform is that they think of punishment as the trial system itself, and the trial system can be quite terrible in many cases, often not punishing those who are guilty. So I think one way to relook at prison reform is to remember that first we have to look at judiciary reform and trial reform so that guilty people actually end up in prisons. We have to remember that the majority of people in prisons are still people who are largely not convicted. So if we remember that, then maybe we can start changing perceptions on prison reform.
Right, sir. So when I read your topic, so as a common man, the first thought that comes in my mind when I see a person being imprisoned is that they would have committed a crime and so therefore are bearing the consequence. But in your paper, you have mentioned the rise of convicts from religious minority backgrounds during the regime of populist parties. So how justified is that statement, or what did you find out in your thesis?
Yeah, in the West, there's an anecdote that says, don't do the crime if you can't do the time, which is basically the idea that people who do crimes should deserve to be punished and therefore have this certain institution that we call prisons. And whether they're humane or not humane is really not of anyone's concern because they're there for punitive action, right? However, even before we got into the narrowing down of this particular topic, and I say we to refer to all the different people that helped me on this research journey, we already knew that 70% of people in prisons are under trials. Now, of that, we found that a majority of people in prison belong to the majoritarian religion in this country, the majoritarian ethnic group. Despite that, we found that if you take it on a prisoner per million, right? You take the total population base of the different religious and ethnic groups. We find that the minority and religious ethnic groups were largely overrepresented, which means that there were far more people from a minority background, not in terms of absolute numbers, but in terms of representation. I hope you get what I'm saying, where, if a particular group, let's say, has 2% representation in the country, but has 4% of prisoners from that group in prisons, then that's an overrepresentation. And we largely found that to be the trend. Now, we studied this from 1998 because that's the year from which prisoner data was available. And we studied it right till 2019 because that's the last known report that came out from the Prison Statistics of India. And what we saw is, yes, there was a gradual rise anyways of minorities over this time, but there was a sharp rise somewhere halfway in the middle of this timeline. And one of the things that changed halfway in the middle of this timeline, between 1998 to 2019, is how we shape policy. See, policy has always been constitutional in this country. However, over time, populist parties in different states have emerged. And what are populist parties? They are parties that prefer to make policy based on what the people want, rather than what might be in the form of a social contract or the constitution, right? And we found that when those parties arise in different states, there seems to be a correlation between the emergence of such party and the sharp increase in the imprisonment of religious minorities. Now, does this mean that populist parties are evil and therefore immediately go after religious minorities? Not at all. What it does suggest, however, is that when populism becomes the method of policy making, a certain ideology is created in that particular region or that particular state. And that ideology is one that sees the habits, the customs, the traditions of the majority or of the people who support that populist party as correct and everybody else as deviant. And it's because of that ideology that we see this sharp rise of, especially of minority populations.
Right. So like when you were talking about ideology, do you think that populist parties are somewhere favoring policies for a majoritarian religion, and by some way is it having an effect on the prison system in India?
I think that's something that's happened specifically in India, and maybe we can talk about other countries also where this is happening, but specifically to India, populism and majoritarian nationalism. So what is majoritarian nationalism? Majoritarian nationalism, nothing but the idea that you are nationalist or you are patriotic if you are following the ideals, the value systems, the traditions of the majority ethnic group in this country. Okay, we all know which is the majority religious group in this country, and we all know which is the majority ethnic group. And as long as you're in line with the traditions, customs, and value system of that particular ethnic group or religious group, then you are largely a nationalist or you're largely patriotic. Now, this idea has gained popularity over the recent few years, and therefore I am saying that populism and majoritarian nationalism have married in India, which is not always true for all other countries, but we are seeing it in many other such populist countries that majority nationalism comes into force. When majority nationalism comes into force, what I just now said becomes very evident for trial and punishment, which is the idea that as long as you are following the traditions, value systems, and culture of the majority religious ethnic group, it may be difficult or it might be counterproductive or counterintuitive to have too many people from that group lavishing in prisons, because then it goes against your ideology that you are trying to build, right? Again, I'm not trying to say that when populist parties come into power that they tend to favor the people who support them and do not put them through trial and punishment or any of that. No, none of that. And in fact, we have to believe that the judiciary is an independent branch of government and is not affected by politics. Absolutely true. Yet, time after time, in different data sets, we are seeing this stark comparison between minorities and majority religion participants of the imprisonment system. And we have to question that. And that was the point of the research. What we're largely seeing is a correlation. But the scope of this research was not to find out why that correlation is there. However, some recommendations or some lenses that we can take is that there tends to be a certain distaste or a certain harsher mindset when two people have committed the same crime, yet one might be in line with the populist ideologies prevailing in the state or region at that time, and one might be a deviant. We find two different forms of action usually taking place. And that has nothing to do with judiciary bias, that has more to do with the ideology created in the state. So yes.
That's very interesting, sir. To go ahead, sir, by any chance, did your study reveal the nature of crime for which these religious minorities have been increasingly imprisoned under the majoritarian governments? Or did you kind of notice a pattern to the kind of crime for which they were imprisoned?
Yeah, so to understand this, we have to understand a few things that people might go to prison for, and that we're generally seeing more and more people going to prison for. So it's one thing to go to prison for a crime, like let's say you're a perpetrator of a crime. It's another thing to go to prison for what we call preventive detention, the idea that you might stir up some trouble, so we should ideally detain and imprison you. Or the idea that you might be part of a larger movement that is stirring up trouble. These are all ideas that find their way into our legal system and cause the real heart of the issues. So this research but uncovered that largely the rise has been in these areas: preventive detention, being part of a group that threatens nationalism, part of a group that might be a threat to the Official Secrets Act, right? So part of a group that threatens the very structure and very fabric of the government itself. And sometimes we see in these media articles and all the people who are imprisoned, and we'll say, how can that person possibly destabilize a government, right? We'll see comedians, for example, or activists, or we'll see those kind of personalities, and we'll say that, oh, okay, how are these people a threat to the government? But the idea is supposed to be that the organizations they work with, the movements that they are part of, those movements threaten populism. And if they threaten populism, then they threaten policy making and threaten, therefore, to throw society into chaos. So one of the areas that we're definitely seeing sharp rises is in these areas: preventive detention, imprisonment for crimes against the state, and imprisonment for particularly for crimes that have a political and economic slant to them.
Right, sir. Moving forward, so as we know, public order, police, and prisons are state subjects. So, did you by any chance notice any state specific variation in the conviction rates of religious minorities?
Okay, so I don't want to take the name of specific states, but it is very evident that there are certain states that have a far greater mandate when it comes, a far different mandate rather than a greater mandate, a far different mandate when it comes to imprisonment policies. Certain states have housed 3 or 4 times the number of prisoners compared to other states. Is there a variation between certain states as to, okay, this particular state has less religious minorities compared to another state? No, there is not. At least not one that is majorly different. So this was the result that we were expecting, but actually turned out to be false, which is no, there are not statewide differences between how religious minorities are treated in prisons. That is to say that state A does not necessarily house more religious minorities in the prisons than state B. We're largely seeing a uniform pattern here emerging where, and what we are seeing, and this only I'm talking about among the populist states. Right. So to do this particular research, we compared states where populist parties have won the election, not where populist parties just exist, but where they've actually won the election, and we compared them to states where populist parties are yet to win the election or are not in power. Right. Which gave us a unique challenge as to how do you classify a party as populist in the first place? Who are we to say that a party is populist and not populist? So we looked at various factors. We looked at the party's manifesto, the party's identification of themselves, the kind of policies that they had taken, and then we classified them as populist, strongly populist, mildly populist, or not populist at all, based on these different factors. And we found that in states where the party in power was classified as not populist at all, tended to, and I'm saying tended to very carefully, tended to have a lesser representation of minorities in prison as compared to states where the parties that were classified as strongly populist were in power. So, but among the parties that were classified as strongly populist, no, there's no state-wise differentiation. So basically among the populist parties that are in power, those states showed very little or no difference in how minorities were represented in prisons.
Thank you, sir. That gave a great insight on your thesis. So to end with, sir, as a society, we look at prison and prison system as a place where, they are punished. So what recommendation can you give to change the way society not only looks at prisoners, but also the prison system?
The government has studied prisons since we got independence, and there have been multiple committees, and two very important ones. I'll just mention one actually, is the Mullah Committee. And the Mullah Committee came up with various ways that prison can be effective. The funny thing about prisons is, in any other form of policy making, let's say economic policy or healthcare policy or education policy, if a particular strategy is shown to us to not be working and an alternative is tested and that alternative is working, then in any other form of policy making, we choose the alternative, right? So let's say, for example, in healthcare, we try a quarantine strategy, and the quarantine strategy largely proves to be ineffective. So we go for mass vaccination. And the mass vaccination shows a reduction in, let's say, COVID numbers. So then mass vaccination is a strategy we adopt, correct? However, in prisons, we seem to have a very different stance, because largely we've seen that when we go for traditional forms of punishment, crime rates do not decrease. In the same period between 1998 and 2019, crime rates increased far higher in proportion to the imprisonment, which means that imprisonment is not a deterrence at all to crime. At the same time, a very unique concept came up in India called open prisons, and there have been other prisons where reformative activity has taken place. And we found that in those areas where reformative activity has taken place, the whole area's crime rate has reduced. So the effects of reform are not about a prisoner itself. And I think it's because we cannot justify it to ourselves of ever letting a prisoner go, let's say, right? Or treating a prisoner less than what they might deserve in our minds, that we largely do not understand prison reform. Prison reforms are not about reforming a particular prisoner only. They are about reforming crime at its very core. They are about addressing cycles of crime. They are about addressing social inequalities. They are about addressing how societies function at their very core and how crime can be eliminated at those macro levels. So when we don't support prison reform, what we're actually not supporting is social reform. So if we believe in social reform, then we have to believe in prison reform as a vital component of it.
I think I've learned a new perspective today dealing with prison system in India. Thank you so much, sir, for being part of our podcast series. It was an honor having you.
Absolutely.